Hey, true crime fanatics, I'm Jake Barton, creator of the history storytelling podcast called Historium, and you're listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. Creating a podcast is not that simple. It's more than just recording yourself and uploading it. To really get your show to be everything you want it to be, you're going to need a little more than that. You need easy and reliable hosting so that your time can be spent creating your content. The most accurate download stats so you know that you're reaching the audience that you're wanting to, and a web page that makes setting up totally easy on you and won't take up too much of your valuable time. And BLUBRRRY offers all of this and more for hosts and aspiring hosts alike. Simple media hosting, a fully integrated WordPress website with their PowerPress sites. So, if you already have a podcast, or you've always dreamed about starting one, head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up, and the first month is on us. The BLUBRRRY support team is available to walk you through the steps of migrating your show without losing any subscribers, or to help you get started in the process of launching your new show. With the first month for free, using promo code DREAM, you've got no excuses. So let's get started. I first want to thank everyone out there who has called and left a message for me to play on the anniversary episode, which is coming up on the 27th of June. It's still not too late to call. I can add your messages until the very last minute. So if you haven't, there's still time. The voicemail number is area code 530-346-4084. Again, thanks to all of you who have called, and let's get the show started. So, who out there listening has had a favorite radio talk show? For me, I mostly listened to the radio in the 80s and the 90s, and I kind of went between two radio stations. And maybe any of you listening from the Los Angeles or Orange County metropolitan areas, you may have listened to the same DJs too. For me, it was Rick Dees in the morning on Kiss FM and Kevin and Bean on K-Rock. Rick Dees became the morning DJ on Kiss in 1981, all the way up until a contract dispute ended his run there in 2004, only to be replaced by Ryan Seacrest. As for Kevin and Bean, their show started on K-Rock in 1990 and continues to this day. And they have a podcast, of course. Both of these shows collectively ran for nearly my entire life, and I'll always think of them as my go-to morning stations. And you know, when it came to music, if you were an 80s kid like me, you were relegated to recording songs off the radio onto tapes, unless you were lucky enough to have the money to buy all the tapes and records that you wanted at the music store. Sam Goody's or The Warehouse or Tower Records. And as time wore on and I got older, I started buying CDs, then I started burning my own CDs, then downloading music to MP3 players, then I got my iPhone, and then I discovered podcasts, and radio was just not my go-to thing anymore. Occasionally I'll tune into some of the morning shows, but I find myself getting super bored quickly with the morning banter and the inside jokes that I don't get between the hosts, and the seemingly endless streams of commercials. I quickly reach for my phone and see what podcast episodes I have to listen to. And the reason I'm talking about this is because in the 80s, there was a top-rated drive time radio show in the city of Denver, Colorado, hosted by two morning rock DJs, Stephen B. Williams and Don Hawkins, collectively known as Stevie B and the Hawk, on the radio station KPBI. Together, they were a unique and creative team. They were an original comedic duo who had the ability to attract a huge audience. The music they played didn't really matter. People were tuning in to listen to their show. In Denver, they were pretty much regarded as the city's celebrity DJs. And not only within the confines of Denver, but really across the region. For 4 years, the two of them ruled the morning FM radio ratings. They were a rock station, but they were not the shock jock types. Much of their humor was aimed at themselves. Being in the business, they poked fun at the entertainment industry, and a part of their shtick was to parody movie and television stars, one of their favorites being an ongoing daytime soap opera spoof, turning it into a series of their own for their show that they named after some of the soaps of the day. Edge of Guiding Days of My Children Turning Hospital. It was a big hit with listeners. And they also found success in doing commercials and gaining endorsement deals. But sadly, in 1994, when Don Hawkins went in for a routine surgery, he actually passed away during the procedure, and thus ended their run as Denver's top morning radio talk show. Stephen B. was destined for greatness in life. He had a voice tailor-made for radio. He had a very close set of friends who adored the guy. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. And those are exactly the things about him that everyone loved, but that would ultimately lead one person to take advantage of the unsuspecting former DJ. In today's 53rd episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the radio star. Off the shores of Southern California, there is an island you may have heard of called Santa Catalina Island, or just Catalina for short. It's 22 miles off the southwest coast of Los Angeles, and on a clear day, you can see it from some of the beach vantage points along our coast. The island was originally settled by Native Americans, and the first Europeans to force them out and claim the land of their own was the Spanish Empire. From then, territorial claims to Catalina shifted between Mexico and finally to the United States. The island had mostly been used for smuggling, otter hunting, and mining for gold. However, at the beginning of the 1920s, Catalina Island was transformed into a bustling tourist destination by chewing gum mogul William Wrigley Jr. Catalina is a part of the Channel Islands of California, and its jurisdiction lies within Los Angeles County. So when something happens on or around Catalina, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is in charge, and they have a station on the island. And over the years, since records have been kept, people have died in and around the waters of Catalina Island, most of those being attributed to small aircraft accidents, but some drownings. The first known drowning having been John Patrick O'Connell in 1875. In 1890, a sailor from San Francisco named William O'Neill drowned at the Isthmus of Catalina. S.F. Knight was swept off the deck of the Warrior in 1902 and drowned. Also in 1902, George Siglason committed suicide by jumping into the bay from the end of the Catalina Wharf. Between 1905 and 1918, 8 more people drowned, committed suicide, or washed ashore on the island. The 1920s only saw a couple of drowning deaths, most of the other ones being boating and aircraft accidents. And interestingly enough, there has been one unidentified murdered person that decade, shot in 1927. And I looked, and there is nothing online about this case. The 1930s saw more accidental deaths, falls, and one murder. However, there was some sort of quarry explosion in 1934 that accounted for most of the deaths on Catalina that decade. In 1936, Walter Jensen, and in 1939, Jack Griffin both fell off their fishing boats and drowned in the waters around Catalina. The 1940s saw more accidents, but one in particular accounted for the most deaths that decade on Catalina: the crash of Goodyear blimp USN K-111 in 1944. Also in 1944, an unknown pilot drowned in some kelp beds in the waters off of Catalina when he bailed from his USN F-4U plane. And 11-year-old Robert Ross drowned while diving for coins in 1946. The 1950s actually saw a spike in drownings. Robert Johnson in 1950, Timothy Haight and Luis Larica in 1954, George Dawson in 1957, and in 1958, Henry Hill, Gene Turner, Vincent Mazer, Edward Vanderwent, George Hudspeth, Dean Connery, and John Long all drowned, with both Vanderwent and Hudspeth disappearing together following a boating accident. The 1960s also had a slew of drownings, a dozen in all, and during the 1970s, 20 people lost their lives to drowning. And at the beginning of the 1980s, one of the island's most famous deaths occurred, the drowning of 43-year-old actress Natalie Wood, when she ended up in the water while sailing on Robert Wagner's boat in 1981. But hers was not the only Hollywood-related death. In 1989, Brian Bollinger was killed in an accident involving the filming of Red October. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, those years and decades also saw a plethora of plane crashes and drownings amongst a spattering of other accidents. But in that span of 30 years, there were 2 murders. In 2001, Eva Marie Weinfurter was murdered by her boyfriend. And in 2006, the man I'm going to talk to you about today, the DJ I talked about at the beginning of the show, Stephen B., when he was discovered in the waters of Catalina, he was known as John Doe number 88. But before we discuss how he ended up floating in the Catalina Channel, let's talk a little bit about his life leading up to this. Stephen Bailey Williams was better known to the people who knew him, family, friends, and fans, as Stephen B. He was a radio DJ with a really unique voice and a personality to match, and he was one half of the duo I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Stephen B. and the Hawk, the bird and the bee. According to one of Stephen's friends of more than 30 years, the two of them were considered pioneers of the two-guy morning radio talk show format. They were the perfect combination of comedy as well as great friends. And Stephen was the kind of guy who kept a very, very close circle of friends for his entire life. In his early days, he started out as a DJ at a radio station in Hawaii, and alongside him, he worked with a young woman named Sylvia Nolan. She soon developed a crush on him, and one day she worked up the nerve to ask him if he would go to a Beach Boys concert with her. But he declined her invitation, and she was pretty bummed that he said no. And it would be later on that day, another employee at the station informed her that Stephen would have likely accepted if she were a guy. And Sylvia was like, "What?" She was kind of naive at the time, and her coworker further explained, "He's gay." And she was like, "Oh, I see." And from then on, the two of them became best of friends. And when Stephen wasn't on the airwaves, he was quite an excellent cook. As his friends would describe, in the kitchen, he was a phenomenon. In watching interviews with his friends, it's very easy to see that Stephen was much loved by his close friends. When they talk about him, they laugh and they smile, and they enjoy speaking of their friend very, very much. It's evident that he meant a lot to a lot of people. And then the 90s rolled in, and his radio partner, the Hawk, suddenly and unexpectedly passed away in 1994. I saw one report that said Stephen's DJing style and persona were no longer that big of a hit with radio audiences. I don't know what, if any, extent he went to continue working in radio once the Hawk died. I couldn't find any information about that. But I could very easily imagine Stephen having difficulty finding his place again in radio without his right-hand guy. I don't know if he tried to go solo, or if he just altogether walked away from the business, but he did, sometime in the mid-90s. He moved on to other ventures. For a time, he worked in the winery business, and he became quite the excellent chef. But it didn't seem like that was going to be a long-term thing for Stephen. He would eventually end up in Southern California, Corona del Mar specifically, to provide care for his dad, whose health was declining. And in 2003, Stephen's father passed away. It was a huge loss for him. But it was his father's death that would be something that would alter the direction that his life was going. And to be honest, whatever direction he was headed, there aren't a lot of details out there. His friends did speak to the media, but of course, like I said, they spoke very highly and very lovingly of him, as I have no doubt Stephen was all of the wonderful things that they described him as. However, to me, in looking at his life, he seemed like a puzzle, and I can't quite put my finger on what pieces are missing. He was this very popular radio DJ. He was gay, but there did not seem to be any significant other in his life at any point. If there was, no one really specifically has said that they were. He didn't have any children, and it seemed like his only family was his dad and a sister that lived far away. He had friends, and he seemed quite amicable, easy to like, easy to love. And it wasn't too long after his father's passing in 2003 that Stephen made a new friend. And this new friend was someone who was opening Stephen's world up to some new adventures in life. Remember, if we consider Stephen as just kind of drifting through life, and someone new and exciting comes along with this big dream of doing something he'd never done before, he might just be the perfect person at the perfect time in his life to get sucked into the whirlwind of exhilaration that was kicking up around him. This new friend was a man named Harvey Morrow. And boy, did he have an offer his new friend Stephen could not refuse. You see, this guy Morrow had just purchased a yacht. And in getting to know Stephen, he told him about this new yacht. And he talked to him about him and his wife having plans to sail around the world in it. How amazing would that be, dreamers, to be able to live out that life in retirement? It might not necessarily be a yacht, but maybe even traveling by road in an RV, visiting places you've never seen, like one big, infinite vacation. I don't know if that would be something that would be for me, per se, but I can certainly appreciate the lure of such an adventure. Stephen is taking all of this in. Here he is now in his life, in his late 50s. His career as a DJ is long in the past. His father has passed away. He doesn't have any kids. Nothing is really keeping him tied down in Southern California, is there? And along comes this Harvey Morrow, telling him of an around-the-world adventure. I'm certain Stephen is romanticizing the idea of this in his mind while listening to Morrow's retirement plans. Stephen's retirement life probably seemed pretty drab in comparison. But Morrow suddenly came up with this idea, an offer, if you will. Stephen really doesn't have much going on in his life at the time, and he loves to cook. Why doesn't Stephen come along on the sail around the world and be his personal chef? Wait, what? Going along on an unbelievable journey around the world? Get to live on this yacht, which, by the way, Morrow is outfitting with the best amenities and the latest technology available, to tag along on this trip to see the entire planet, and all he has to do is prepare meals for Morrow and his wife? I don't know if there was any other payment agreement or salary offered, or if this was to be done in exchange for living on the yacht, and the opportunity to sail around the world. But it was such a fantastic offer. How could he refuse that? Here's the thing. Stephen knew nothing about sailing. Absolutely zero. But his close friends could see that Stephen was very excited about the prospect of this. They saw it as a much-needed diversion for him. Something he seemingly needed in his life. Something to keep his focus on. Something to put his efforts towards, particularly in the wake of his father's death, which was devastating for him. His friend Sylvia thought the idea of sailing around the world was an incredible opportunity, and she was really excited for her friend to embark on this new adventure. So it was a done deal. Stephen was going to take Morrow up on his offer and go for it. So, dreamers, is there something that seems a little fishy about this? No pun intended. You know, when they say, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Let's think about this for a moment. Stephen met this man, Harvey Morrow, and he has a wife whom I will tell you more about a little bit later. Just hang tight. He's purchased this yacht and he wants to sail it around the world, just him and his wife. It would be quite a daunting task, don't you think? I mean, I'm not exactly an expert on sailing. However, if any of you listening are on or have been on Patreon, you will see that in May I published an extra bonus for the $5 and above level donors entitled The Journey That Never Was, which is the story of Donald Crowhurst, a gentleman from England who joined in a race to sail around the world in 1968. Well, that particular story gave me the chance to research sailing, specifically the circumnavigation of the Earth. And you guys, that sail is no joke. And I was under the impression that it is not a sail for pleasure boaters. You need to be a very skilled, open ocean sailor and have a great deal of knowledge and know-how to make a journey as epic as that. So Morrow, who was about 55 years old at the time in 2006, is telling Stephen that he is going to make this sail with his wife and he wants him to be his hired chef. I mean, like I said, not an expert, but don't you think that a voyage like that, you might want to at least find someone to bring along who has some sailing experience? Why would the only crew on board be a chef that had not an inkling of how to sail a boat for a trip like that? Now, the Donald Crowhurst story involved the sail being single-handed and non-stop, but I am certain that any one of those men, if they could have had a first mate or a deckhand, they would have brought one along with them. But a chef? And when you're sailing, you've got all the time in the world, just you and your wife. Does it seem plausible that they would require a whole extra person with the sole purpose of preparing meals? We all here listening, by nature of being true crime fans, are the skepticalists. Okay, well, that's not really a word. We are the most skeptical of skeptics out there. In this, if Stephen B. was our friend, don't you think we'd be all over him to dig a little bit deeper into this guy? And if you take a look at his pictures online, he even looks like kind of one of those fast-talking kind of guys with the slick back hair and the phony baloney smirk on his face. I just got a bad vibe from his picture alone. And you guys, I don't think any of us would take this job offer to be a chef on a yacht as legit at face value, especially if you know this about your good friend Stephen B. When his dad died in the summer of 2003, he inherited $2 million. Yep. How does that shift the story for you? $2 million. Let me tell you a little bit about Stephen's dad. He was retired Colonel Bailey Williams, an ace pilot who had flown missions in Vietnam and was a U-2 pilot as well. When he retired from the U.S. Air Force, he became a defense contractor with Rockwell International, which is a major manufacturing conglomerate in the second half of the 20th century, which was involved in the production of aircraft, the space industry, defense and commercial electronics, automotive and truck parts, printing presses, meters, valves, and industrial automation. At its peak, it landed number 27 on the Fortune 500 list, but the company went defunct in 2001. Colonel Williams was married and they had 2 children, Stephen and Jan, and they lived in Hawaii. In 1963, he retired from the Air Force, and that's when he moved to Corona del Mar and worked at the Rockwell plant in El Segundo, California, which is quite a commute, 45 miles across Orange County into Los Angeles County and back, along the busiest interstate in the nation, the 405. During rush hour, it's easily a 2-hour commute one way, but that's today. I'm sure it was easier back then with much less traffic and congestion. Stephen's sister Jan moved to Philadelphia in 1970, and over the course of time, Jan became disabled and Stephen's mom passed away. So when the family moved to Corona del Mar, Stephen had stayed back in Hawaii. He made a name for himself as a DJ at a radio station in Honolulu, where he became relatively successful and well-known in the area. And as I had mentioned earlier, he moved to Denver, where he had his highly successful run there as the Voices of the Rockies with the Hawk. When that ended, he no longer sought work as a DJ. He did dabble in voiceover work, however. He eventually moved to San Francisco and became a gourmet chef and wine expert. In the 90s, Stephen had made some bad investments, and he was also delinquent in filing his taxes. But he had a friend who was kind of a financial advisor of sorts, and he helped him sort through some of his financial difficulties. It's been said that Stephen had all the best intentions, that he was simply a terrible organizer and money manager. In the summer of 2001, Stephen moved to Napa, California, and you all know that that's wine country. He worked there for a short time at a winery, but in October of 2001, Stephen's dad was injured in a fall at home and required hospitalization and rehabilitation. For a while, Stephen drove back and forth from Napa to Corona del Mar to help care for him, but by 2002, it was clear that Dad needed more help. So Stephen quit his job at the winery and moved in with his dad to provide full-time care for him. At the same time, his father created a will and trust with the help of a family attorney. His estate would be divided equally between Jan and Stephen. Stephen's portion would be unrestricted, but his sister's was not, and Stephen was named the trustee for his sister's half of the inheritance, as well as the executor of the will. The trust was written in such a way that Jan would be given a one-time payment of $25,000 and then $10,000 twice a year thereafter, with provisions for additional disbursements for medical and other expenses. Stephen's dad passed away in the summer of 2003. So yeah, it seems like Stephen's dad worked very hard for his entire life and was either able to invest really well, live modestly, or a combination of the two, and he squirreled away a couple $1,000,000 to ultimately end up falling in the lap of his son, Stephen, who, by contrast, handled his own personal finances in the exact opposite manner in which his father had. According to his friends, Stephen, a financial wizard, he was not. But by all appearances, he seemed to live a very full life, with many interests, many hobbies, and many friends. He seemed to be the kind of man that wanted and needed to live every moment of life to the fullest, and in the process lived very much in the moment, He didn't have a master plan when it came to his finances. But I didn't get the impression that it was meant to be in an irresponsible way. He just wanted to enjoy life, and he worked. And when it came to the nature of the business he was in, the radio business, it seems like a thing that could ebb and flow. He hit a pinnacle in the 80s and then it dropped off from there. He was a radio personality, and he was a comedian. It was probably something that took a great deal out of him to sustain for so many years. And when his partner died, a part of him likely died as well. That part of him that was the loud, deep-voiced, quick-witted radio DJ. I'm obviously not a comedian, and aside from all of you out there listening to me, I basically sit here and talk to myself. But imagine your favorite true crime podcasting duo out there who have the perfect chemistry. They not only play off of each other, but they also balance each other out. And then imagine all of a sudden one of them was gone. What are the chances the one remaining would be able to carry on the workload of both of them alone? Or if they were to bring on a replacement co-host and try to fill the shoes of the now absent one? Would it work? Would the fan base remain loyal? Perhaps. Podcast listeners can be fickle. 1 minute they can love you, and then the next they're raging mad at something you said or did and tune you out. Even a second season of an all-time favorite show with the same host or host can fall flat with the loyalist of fans because the first was such a tough act to follow. So when the Hawk died, I don't think Stephen B. thought that he was ever going to be able to recapture what they had. And with that, the source of Stephen's livelihood evaporated. But maybe, just maybe, he understands in the back of his mind that with his dad's passing, he's going to land on his feet financially. I'm not insinuating that he decided to slack off until his dad kicked the bucket. There's no doubt that Stephen worked diligently and hard for many years at what he did in the radio business. He was successful, but he wasn't a planner. His friends and their interviews made that abundantly clear. Stephen was terrible with money. He was terrible with paperwork. He was a terrible organizer, to the point where he had gone years without even filing his taxes. Now, to us, that sounds kind of like a big illegal deal, and we might be likely to jump to judgy conclusions about that. I don't know why Stephen would go years and not file income taxes, but to his friends, they chalked it up to his inability to organize or focus his thoughts on matters such as taxes. And it wasn't just taxes. It was anything that involved paperwork. It was as if the man was allergic to it or something. Not making excuses for the guy. This is just the way his friends described him. Forgetful, thoughtless, irresponsible. Some might say carefree, free-spirited, and flighty. Whatever it was, I don't get the sense that there was any maliciousness in his actions. But Stephen would later go on to conduct himself in some questionable ways when it came to his finances. And you will come to see why I'm kind of on the fence about how I feel about it when I go on to tell you the manner in which he handled the windfall of his father's inheritance. So, reaching retirement age, no family other than his sister, he doesn't seem to be that close to, no children, nothing anchoring him down to any particular place, and now, $2 million landing in Stephen's lap. Along comes a new friendship, with an unexpected yet enticing proposition from Harvey Morrow. He's coming at Stephen. I have this new yacht. I'm refurbishing it to be one of the most top-of-the-line luxury yachts out there. My wife and I are going to sail off around the world in our retirements, and we need a chef to live on board and pamper us with gourmet meals along the way. Stephen was sold. So let's talk a little bit about Harvey Morrow. It wasn't just a chance encounter that the two men crossed paths. Stephen had an old acquaintance from his days back in Hawaii, Michael Niebuhr. He was also a transplant from Hawaii who ended up in Denver, Colorado, where he worked as a head trader at a Denver brokerage firm called Lloyd Wade Securities. Harvey Morrow also worked at the firm, and he and Niebuhr struck up a friendship. However, in 2000, the firm shuttered its doors after it was discovered its top managers, including Niebuhr, had been accused of securities fraud. It was sometime following leaving Lloyd Wade Securities that Morrow purchased that 69-foot steel-hulled motorboat called the Iolair Mara, which he kept moored in a marina in Los Angeles Harbor. The boat, however, when he purchased it, was a fixer-upper. As a matter of fact, it was in terribly poor condition and required a tremendous overhaul. I could not find any information as to how much Morrow paid for the boat, but it's likely, considering that it was in such bad repair, that he got a pretty good deal for it. It was through a mutual friend that Niebuhr heard that his old work buddy was refurbishing the vessel and had plans to sail around the world in it. Well, come to find, Niebuhr was quite an accomplished sailor and asked Morrow if he could help with the refurbishing of the boat and come along on the sail around the world. He offered to be the chef and to be a deckhand. And it sounded like a pretty good deal to Morrow, so the men agreed to terms. Niebuhr moved to the area, and along with Morrow, they lived on a boat that was owned by one of the carpenters who was working on the repairs of the Iolair Mara. So fast forward to the summer of 2003. Stephen's dad had just passed away, so Niebuhr, his old friend from back in Hawaii, now living relatively in the same area, went to go visit Stephen at the home in Corona del Mar. But when he did, he brought Morrow along with him, and Niebuhr introduced the two men. Niebuhr and Morrow would subsequently make a number of other visits to Stephen at his home in Corona del Mar. It was their observation that the home was somewhat of a mess, filled with books, bills, and financial records everywhere. It was during one of these visits that the two men stepped aside out of earshot of Stephen and spoke privately about Stephen's finances. So I'm not certain it would ever really be clear what the two men discussed regarding Stephen, but if I were to guess, I would say that they were eyeballing some of Stephen's paperwork he had strewn about the house. He may have even expressed the stress over having to deal with his father's estate. As previously noted, he was no good at this sort of stuff. He may have disclosed the kinds of money that he was dealing with when it came to his father's estate, without realizing he was coming across as naive and vulnerable. His guard was down, and these two guys, former brokerage employees, likely saw an opportunity to get their hands on some easy money. They had a Goliath of a project going on with Iolair Mara, and it isn't too much of a reach to assume, considering their link to past indiscretions with some security fraud charges, mainly Niebuhr, that they weren't the most financially sound individuals. And here's Stephen, who has suddenly come into a big chunk of money. Were Niebuhr and Morrow looking to make Stephen's windfall their windfall? In October of 2003, Niebuhr and Morrow moved onto the Iolair Mara. They were running short on money and basically living hand to mouth. How they were making money at this point isn't really clear, but Morrow is married and his wife is working, and selling off assets as she is preparing to move towards retirement, she's planning on living on this boat. So she is in some capacity financing Morrow and Niebuhr's project. But I will talk about her more in a bit. Sometime in November of 2003, Niebuhr had returned to Hawaii to get his affairs in order, supposedly, before embarking upon the sail around the world. In the meantime, not too long after Stephen's dad's memorial service, Morrow had made arrangements for Stephen to meet with a certified public accountant and tax attorney named Derek Tung in regards to his father's estate. At the time, Mr. Tung was newly admitted to the bar and was somewhat of a beginner when it came to probate law. And despite the fact that this was in regards to Stephen's financial business, Morrow not only sat in on the meeting with Mr. Tung, he also did the majority of the talking. It was revealed that Stephen's dad's estate consisted of the Corona Del Mar house, about $250,000 in Boeing stock, a car, and a bank account with approximately $150,000. The house was included in the trust, but Stephen was seeking Mr. Tung's assistance in probating the remaining assets. It was during this meeting that Stephen and Morrow showed Mr. Tung a one-page promissory note, purportedly executed in 1982, showing that Stephen's dad had borrowed $240,000 from Morrow's father, Victor Morrow. This note, plus interest, reduced the probated portion of the estate by $320,000, and that just about zeroed out the entire probate estate, thereby reducing the amount of federal income taxes owed. Mr. Tung was skeptical. He was uncertain of the authenticity of the note because, to him, this was way too simplistic for such a large loan. And what's more, the promissory note was neither witnessed nor notarized. Following the meeting, Mr. Tung contacted Stephen several times, expressing his concerns regarding the note. He advised Stephen that it would be best to decline the debt and to compel Morrow to prove its validity, but Stephen insisted that Morrow was an old family friend and that this debt was legit. Stephen had told that old friend of his, who had helped him with his tax evasion issues some years back, that he and Morrow were attempting to circumvent the tax liability on his father's estate by creating a fictitious note. Stephen told him that Morrow came up with the suggestion that they create a fictitious note and obligation in the form of an IOU that was supposedly between their fathers. This note would also state that the two had been World War II buddies and that Morrow's dad had loaned Stephen's dad the cash with the understanding that it would be repaid out of the trust account. Stephen's friends strongly advised against this. This was a bad idea. That this was kind of wrong and kind of illegal. Stephen brushed aside his friend's sound advice, telling him that this kind of stuff happens all the time, and he would later tell him that they had gone through with the presentation of the fake promissory note. Stephen's dad's estate would go on to be successfully probated in Orange County Superior Court, the note never being challenged. But when Stephen's sister Jan received the probate documents, she saw the IOU. She could immediately see that the signature on the promissory note was not her father's handwriting. As a matter of fact, her dad's first name, Bailey, was actually misspelled, B-A-I-L-Y, instead of the way it's supposed to be spelled, B-A-I-L-E-Y. She called her brother up and questioned him about the IOU, and he admitted to her that it was fictitious in order to reduce the tax liability of the estate. So as the summer wore on, Stephen was telling his old accounting friend more and more about his dealings with Harvey Morrow. Stephen was under the impression that Morrow was a partner at a Denver brokerage firm, and he believed that his net worth to be somewhere in the ballpark of $38 million. Soon, rather than going to his old friend for financial advice, Stephen began relying on Morrow, eventually phasing out his friend altogether. I guess Stephen liked the shortcuts Morrow was willing to take, and his old financial advisor was one to be on the up and up. And And before long, Morrow invited Stephen to be the one to sail around the world on his yacht when the construction of it was completed, and he could serve as the chef on the vessel. Morrow told Stephen if he grew tired of living on the boat, they could invest in a restaurant in the Caribbean for him to operate. Stephen thought this was a fantastic idea. He even had a name in mind for the place if it were to ever come to fruition: Bailey's, after his late father. So remember Stephen's old friend from Hawaii, the young woman who had once asked him to go on a date with her to the Beach Boys concert? Well, she transplanted from Hawaii to the lovely enclave of Rancho Palo Verde, California in 2003. She and Stephen began to have lunch together regularly on a bi-weekly basis. He told her all about Harvey Morrow, and that he was a retired Wall Street financier, and he was willing to help him sort out his affairs with his father's estate. She got the impression that Stephen held Morrow in very high regards. In her words, Stephen had him on a pedestal, and it was Stephen's contention that Morrow was a brilliant financial advisor. By early 2004, Morrow continued shoehorning himself into Stephen's life. By then, he had moved into the Corona Del Mar house with Stephen under the guise that he was going to help him in preparing to put the property up for sale. The house sold quickly in March of 2004 for $1.83 million. It was also during the month of March that Stephen told his old financial advisor that the assets from his father's estate, including the proceeds from the sale of the house, cash, and stocks, would all be transferred into Morrow's accounts. Wait, what? You heard that right. Stephen put everything in the world that he had into Harvey Morrow's name. Morrow told him it was to facilitate the movement of the assets to offshore accounts, a move he had advised Stephen to make. When Stephen's friend asked him if what he was doing was legal, because by now he knows Stephen, seemingly willing to go along with Morrow's financial schemes, doesn't seem thwarted by legalities. But Stephen told him that everything seemed to be above board. But here is what Stephen didn't know. Bank records would later reveal that on March 1st, 2004, Morrow had about $1,000 in his bank account. So this guy is telling Stephen he's worth $38 million, and all he's got is $1,000 to his name? On the same day that bank records reflected the amount, the $1,749,683 from the sale of Stephen's dad's house was deposited into Bailey's trust account. That same month, and in April, 3 checks were written from that trust account. One in the amount of $320,000, a second in the amount of $800,000, and a third in the amount of $498,000, a grand total of $1,618,000, all deposited into Harvey Morrow's personal bank account with that $1,000 he had at Bank of America. Then again in April, $900,000 was transferred from Morrow's Bank of America account to Morrow's Bank of Bermuda account under the name Decca Limited. But over the next few months, the money was moved to a second Decca Limited account at the Bank of Bermuda, and subsequent to that, in a series of transactions, the money was slowly transferred back into Morrow's personal Bank of America account. It was also around that time that Morrow began stepping up the pace of the repairs to the Iolaire Mora, and he also began purchasing very, very expensive equipment for the yacht. This was a very markedly different pace that the work had been conducted previous to this. The work had been going very slowly due to the lack of funds, and he had previously been purchasing second-hand equipment and materials for the work that was being done to the boat. Now everything was brand new, top of the line, and state-of-the-art. Some of the work that he had done on the vessel included a complete repainting and revarnishing of the entire yacht. It was outfitted with brand new, very expensive teak wood decks, brand new masts, a desalinization system, a scuba diving compressor, expensive stainless steel hydraulic winches or pulleys, and the most state-of-the-art high-tech navigation systems, as well as a saltwater washdown pump which could be used to wash off the deck. He also had flat-screen TVs installed, a $50,000 washer-dryer set, and a fireplace. Dreamers, this yacht was lavish. But remember, there was another individual waiting in the wings to go on this sail around the world to serve as the vessel's chef and deckhand, his old business partner Niebuhr. What about him? He had been offered the opportunity first, which he accepted, and he went to Hawaii to get his affairs in order, right? But while he was gone, it seems Stephen had slid right into his place on the yacht. Morrow wasn't going to need the both of them, right? And Stephen was bankrolling the whole thing, and this was actually unbeknownst to Stephen, as if you recall, he thinks his money is sitting in some offshore accounts. In actuality, Morrow is pouring all of Stephen's money into the Iola Armara. Obviously, Morrow needed Stephen to be the one to go along. He was his meal ticket. And this left Morrow with the need to somehow figure out how to eliminate Niebuhr from the equation. I don't know to what extent Niebuhr had invested himself into the renovations of the boat, if at all. I don't know how much work he had put in to getting it prepared. It appears he had some stake in the whole thing, but Stephen was now the man with the money. In May of 2004, Niebuhr called Morrow to tell him that he was going back to Hawaii soon to finish getting ready for their sail around the world. So it seems that Morrow had a plan in mind, a way of pushing Niebuhr out without having to do so much explaining. While they were on the phone, Morrow told Niebuhr that his daughter had been sexually assaulted. Now, whether or not this is true, I don't know, but it's the story he told. And through the course of the conversation, Morrow began to accuse Niebuhr of being insensitive about the news of his daughter's sexual assault, and this was highly upsetting to him. Morrow became very angry over the phone and eventually told Niebuhr to never call him again, and he hung up. Niebuhr was stunned by the turn of events. They had this huge journey planned, and just like that, he was out. He tried calling Morrow several times after he hung up on him, but he was never able to get in touch with Morrow ever again. His plans to sail around the world on the Iola Armara were over. Morrow had some other wheelings and dealings going on at the same time. Also in 2004, he met a man by the name of Leo Rossi at a coffee shop. He overheard Mr. Rossi talking to some of his associates about a new record label that he was trying to produce called the Orphanage Entertainment Group. Of course, Morrow's ears perked right up, and he stuck his nose into the conversation. He told Mr. Rossi that he might be interested in becoming an investor in the record label, and so, supposedly, both he and Stephen put up some money to help finance this venture. Stephen and Morrow ended up moving out of the Corona Del Mar house and sublet a place from Mr. Rossi in a cliffside residence in San Pedro, California. They lived there for about 18 months, and occasionally Morrow's wife Debbie would stay there as well. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you a little bit about her. When Debbie and Morrow went on their first date, he posed this question to her: "What do you want to do when you retire?" Her response: "I want to sail around the world." For her, it was a lifelong dream, and she may not have known it on the first date, but she had finally met the man who was going to share this dream with her to sail the world. Eventually, Morrow slipped a $25,000 ring on her finger, and the couple got married in 2000 at the home they shared in Texas. And it became his goal to have the boat of their dreams and make their sail a reality. Not long after, he purchased the dilapidated old vessel and began working on it. And like I described earlier, the work was moving at a snail's pace in the beginning until he got his hands on Stephen's money, and then the pace picked up. It was Morrow's goal to have the biggest and the best of everything outfitted on the boat. And the work was kind of dragging, longer than both Stephen and Debbie thought it would. And Debbie was also, for her part, putting what money she could into the refurbishing of it as well. You see, Debbie was still working. She was itching to retire and go sailing. But Morrow kept stalling her, that the boat wasn't ready and for her to just keep working until it's ready. She wasn't too keen on delaying her retirement, but I guess she figured that the work was being done and that it would all be worth it in the end. So she kept working. She really had no other options. They owned the boat, and they had poured so much money into it. So she went along with Morrow's plan and just kept working. They couldn't just drop the whole idea because it was taking too long. So they kept pushing forward to get this done. Debbie's dreams were all in that boat. And remember, Stephen doesn't know that his money is being used to finance all the work that's being done to it. He is under the impression that this is Morrow's money that's getting poured into it. He had his sights set on sailing around the world, so I don't even think he was giving it a second thought. But the boat work was taking quite a long time. There was always something new that needed to be done. New computers, or hanging artwork inside the boat, a new fireplace, satellite systems. It was always something delaying the voyage. But what neither Stephen nor Debbie knew is Morrow was stalling to buy himself time. He knew that this wasn't going to be able to go on forever. He's dumping all of Stephen's money into this boat, and he isn't even the slightest bit aware that his and his sister's inheritance is being systematically wiped out by Harvey Morrow. Oh, and by the way, that diamond ring on Debbie's finger? Cubic zirconia. So back to the orphanage entertainment group for a moment. Stephen and Morrow had rented that cliffside place for Mr. Rossi, but the entertainment group turned out to be a failure. It would be Mr. Rossi's contention that Morrow was the one who failed to bring the investors he had promised, and it was in a year's time that the group folded in August of 2005. The men argued about the company and its failure, so Mr. Rossi asked both Stephen and Morrow to move out of the place that they were subletting from him. He severed all business and personal ties with Morrow, but he did remain on good terms with Stephen, and the two would become good friends from then on. It wasn't long after they were asked to leave their sublet apartment that Stephen began complaining that he was running low on money. He was having troubles paying his bills, and he was living on credit cards, and he even began to borrow money from his friends. Towards the end of 2005, Stephen began confiding once again in his original financial advisor about his lack of access to money, telling him he wasn't even really sure where it was, and he was going to have to work with Morrow to figure out some way to obtain access to his money, because he was going broke and getting into debt. Stephen's friend asked him what kinds of documentation he had, if he could see it, and perhaps he could help him figure out something. Any kind of paperwork showing where the money had been deposited into, but Stephen told him that they were going to prepare the documents, but they were never actually physically given to him. Stephen was in a bind. January was coming around, and he was obligated to give his sister the $10,000 disbursement from the trust. Also in January of 2006, Stephen confided in his friend Sylvia that he was becoming worried because he was unable to access the money from the offshore accounts. She told him that that didn't seem right to her, that there should be some way for him to be able to wire money back and forth. Stephen was going to have to figure something out soon, as he wasn't going to be able to keep going like this. But it wouldn't be long before the Iola Mara was on the verge of being finished finally. By early 2006, most of the work was done except for the sails. So Stephen and Morrow moved in and began living on the boat. It had a stateroom with a small cabin. Morrow and his wife would be in the stateroom, and Stephen would have the cabin. Come that February of 2006, Stephen again spoke to his old financial advisor about the money issues he was having, and it was very apparent that Stephen was perturbed by what was going on. At some point, while Stephen was confiding in his friend, Morrow in some capacity walked in on the conversation. Stephen turned to him and said, "I want my money." Morrow's reply was that he was working on it. During the months of March and April, Stephen told his friend that it was his intentions to confront Morrow and to have a come-to-Jesus moment with him about gaining access to his money. And it was his understanding that what Stephen meant by, quote, come to Jesus, was that he was going to have a very firm, a very direct, a very forceful verbal confrontation with Morrow. In the meantime, Stephen's financial advisor friend got married in Northern California on April 15, 2006, and Stephen helped him with the preparations for the big day. Stephen, by all accounts, appeared to be enthusiastic and supportive of his friend. So when he left for his honeymoon in Europe from April 17th to May 3rd, all was well. The two men had plans to celebrate Stephen's 59th birthday, which was May 14th, when he and his new wife returned from Europe. On April 21st, Stephen and Sylvia went out to lunch, but he told her that he didn't have any money to pay for lunch, or for groceries for that matter. So Sylvia paid for lunch, and she offered to loan him money, but he turned her down, telling her that he had plans to talk to Morrow the next day when he got back from a fishing trip, that they were going to sit down and talk this out. Stephen told her that he had his passport handy and he was going to ask Morrow to take him where he needed to go, whatever the country that he had his money in, and help him get it. Little did he know that the money had long been funneled into Morrow's accounts and blown on all of those extravagant upgrades he made to the boat. Whether or not that conversation took place is unknown, but I'm fairly certain at this point Morrow is feeling the pressure from Stephen to cough up his money. Stephen's gone broke, and it's because Morrow caused him to be broke. On May 3rd, 2006, Mr. Rossi, the gentleman Morrow and Stephen had rented that cliffside apartment from, whom Morrow had had a falling out with, but Stephen remained on good terms. He saw Stephen that day at the place that they had once rented from him. He informed him that he was going to sail the Catalina the next day on May 4th with Morrow on the Mora. The plan was to motor to the backside of Catalina, which would be the west-facing side, away from the California shoreline. And it was Stephen's intentions to discuss some of the financial issues with Morrow. Mr. Rossi noted that Stephen, to him, appeared to be his normal, usual, jovial, joke-cracking self, that his frame of mind was good, and nothing about him seemed out of sorts. Stephen did not appear to be depressed, despite his financial woes. The reason this is being brought up is because Stephen's state of mind is going to come into question a little bit later on. Also, in early May of 2006, Morrow made arrangements to go with a gentleman by the name of Mark Landers on a trip to Bishop, California. Mr. Landers was a cabinet maker who had completed some work on the Mora. Morrow told him that he wanted to get away from the harbor and the boat for a few days. He told Morrow that he was planning on leaving for Bishop on May 5th around 5 in the morning, and he was supposed to meet Mr. Landers at his shop, which was only about 10 minutes away from the marina, and that they would depart from there. However, Morrow did not show up. So Mr. Landers called Morrow several times that morning, and when he finally answered, he told him that he had just woken up and he would hurry up and be on his way. He arrived an hour and a half later than the time Mr. Landers wanted to leave, at 6:30 a.m. But Mr. Landers was taken aback by something very odd. Harvey Morrow looked to be in horrible shape. He appeared to not have slept in days. His face was red and swollen, and Landers was quite shocked by Morrow's appearance. Morrow would end up falling asleep for most of the drive up to Bishop. They returned to the Los Angeles area on May 7th, sometime in the late afternoon. A couple of days after the men returned from Bishop, Mr. Landers came aboard the Iola Mara. He knew Stephen was living on the boat, as he had sold his dad's house and was evicted from that rental place. But he again observed something quite strange. Stephen's cabin was not only spotless, it was empty. There was not one trace of anyone living in that cabin at all. Mr. Landers asked Morrow about it. Where was Stephen? Where's all his stuff? Morrow told him that Stephen went to Hawaii. Still, this didn't seem quite to settle the questions in his mind. Stephen was supposed to go around the world on a voyage on this boat, right? He was living on the thing, with no other real place to stay. Why would he wipe out his entire existence out of the cabin for a trip to Hawaii? Wasn't he coming back? When Stephen's friend got back from his honeymoon on May 4th, he tried giving Stephen a call, but he did not receive a response. This was out of character for him. Stephen almost always returned phone calls within a few hours' time, if not sooner. And the more time that passed that he did not hear from Stephen, the more his concerns grew. He began calling mutual friends to see if they had heard from Stephen at all, but no one had seen or heard from him. This was highly unusual and deeply concerning. Stephen was very close to all of his friends. He talked to them regularly, saw them regularly. What's more, he told them everything. He was an open book, so they knew exactly what to expect from Stephen and when. It was sometime around May 11th or 12th that Stephen's friend phoned Morrow and inquired as to his whereabouts. And he had a story at the ready. He said he caught Stephen smoking marijuana on the boat, which he did not approve of. He said Stephen became very defensive and confrontational, packed up his things, and left. And it was Morrow's belief that he took off for Mexico. Over the next 5 days, all of Stephen's friends, his financial advisor, Mr. Rossi, Sylvia, everybody continued to attempt to contact Stephen, to no avail. Finally, on May 19th, Sylvia called Morrow demanding to know what happened to Stephen, and all he told her was he got back from his trip from Bishop and all of Stephen's things were gone, and it was his understanding that Stephen went back to Hawaii. So now, they've got conflicting stories from this guy, and the red flags are going up everywhere. And Stephen's friends are very, very concerned for his safety, worried sick, as a matter of fact. He was ready, eager, and anxious to make this sail around the world, and then suddenly he drops off the grid completely. Not a word to anyone. And remember, this was a man who told everyone everything every day. So no, something was terribly wrong. And they were about to find out what it was. On May 18th, 2006, a gentleman by the name of Donald Goodwin was on a pleasure sail on his boat from Huntington Harbor to Catalina Island when he made a shocking discovery. A body floating face down in the water about 7 miles from the island in the channel that's between the mainland and the island. Birds were circling above. Some were standing on the person's back, pecking at him. Mr. Goodwin stayed nearby and radioed the Coast Guard. The Catalina Island Sheriff joined, and they went out to the location to retrieve the body, which was in very advanced stages of decomposition. So much so that when they lifted the body onto their boat, it ruptured. The body had been bloated, discolored, but it was fully clothed with a coat, gloves, and shoes on. But he had no identification, and it was immediately apparent that the body had been in the water for quite some time, as barnacles had already began growing on the bottom of the shoes. Remember at the beginning I told you that this was a John Doe case. It wasn't even apparent what race the person was or what sex. But there were two things that became apparent after the autopsy was conducted on May 23rd. One was this man was missing 3 fingers from his left hand, and it was clear that they had been missing for a long time. And 2 was that he suffered 1 gunshot wound to the back of the head. This was no boating accident. This was no accidental drowning. This was a homicide. It would be a few more days later that the detectives assigned to this John Doe case would get a call from a concerned individual who had not heard or seen a friend for several weeks. And he was very worried. And his friend, as it were, was missing 3 fingers from his left hand as a result from a woodshop accident in middle school. Investigators finally had a name for their victim: Stephen B. Williams. No longer was it a mystery where he was. Now, it was a matter of who put him there. On May 25, 2006, with a search warrant in hand, investigators boarded the Iola Mara and searched for any evidence as to what may have happened to Stephen. And they were anxious to talk to Harvey Morrow, but he was not there at the time. He was actually having breakfast with a gentleman by the name of Gregory Labano, a welder who had completed some work on the boat for Morrow. Law enforcement officers from several agencies were at the scene, and several officers were in the marina parking lot. The harbor patrol boat was parked next to the Iola Mara, and several divers searched the waters surrounding the boat. A marina office manager actually did spot Morrow walking towards the boat at the same time the diving search was being conducted, but he immediately stopped, turned around, and casually walked away. 2 people who knew him, who were in the vicinity of the marina when the boat was being docked and ultimately seized, contacted Morrow by phone to tell him the presence of police on and around his boat, but to them, he did not seem all that concerned. Morrow never made any attempt to contact authorities as to what was going on with the boat. The vessel was towed to a secure slip in Marina del Rey at approximately 10:30 a.m. on the morning of the 25th. It was immediately apparent to detectives that the vessel was immaculately clean. As a matter of fact, the boat was in such a pristine condition that there was not even a trace that Stephen had ever existed on the thing, much less ever lived on it. They did find that the boat was outfitted with a very sophisticated navigation system, and investigators had hoped that it would be able to tell them where the boat had been. But when it was analyzed by experts, the system had never been turned on. It wasn't even connected yet. They did find an instruction manual for a handheld GPS device, but only the manual. The GPS itself was nowhere to be found. Investigators searched everywhere on the boat, top to bottom, for the accompanying device. And you know what else they couldn't seem to find? Harvey Morrow. He suddenly disappeared as well. Investigators began looking into his background to see what, if anything, they could dig up about this person. And they found out some quite interesting things about the guy. And it all depended who you talked to. Some said Morrow was a wealthy man, worth upwards of several millions of dollars. But at least one of his neighbors at the yacht club was kind of skeptical about him. There was just something sketchy about the guy, at least to her. When investigators spoke to her, she was quite candid about it. She told them that she and her husband they have money, and they live comfortably on their yacht. And she knew instantly from the first time that she saw Harvey Morrow that he was full of it, because nobody dresses like Gilligan and the skipper when you're on your yacht. He always showed up at the marina, in her words, in costume, trying too hard to fit in, to play a role that wasn't his to play. At least to her, he was a complete farce. And what about the guy's work history? What was he about? Was there anything he had ever done that could account for this lifestyle he was portraying himself to be living? Not really. Investigators would soon find out that just about everything Morrow ever dabbled in throughout his so-called banking or stockbrokering career was always a failure. And if his ventures weren't going completely belly up, there was almost always some kind of fraud attached to whatever it was he had his hands in. As a matter of fact, detectives really could not find at any point in Harvey's career did he actually have any kind of bona fide employment that earned him any kind of legitimate means of income for any significant, consistent period of time. So this led detectives to wonder, how well was Morrow handling his job as the financial advisor, or so-called financial advisor, to Stephen in regards to his and his sister's inheritance? Stephen's friend Sylvia was able to recall for investigators that sometime just before he disappeared, that someone broke into his car and stole some very important documents out of the trunk. He kept all of his personal paperwork in there, including his passport, his family trust documents. All of it was stolen. Strange things for someone robbing a car to take, don't you think? Usually when people's cars are broken into, it's something that was an opportunistic crime. A passerby sees something of value in the car, through the window, maybe some money stashed in a cup holder, or a bag or a backpack sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat. But financial and personal documents in a trunk? Is a person who's wanting to commit fraud or identity theft looking for these kinds of things in a briefcase in the trunk of a car? Maybe. If it was someone who knew that those things would be of value to him, who knew that those things would be in the trunk, and who knew enough about the person to put those things to good use in order to commit some kind of fraud against the person from whom those items were being stolen. When Stephen told Sylvia about the stolen documents, she asked him if the documents between himself and Morrow were in there as well, as this concerned her because she knew Stephen had turned the trust over to him, and the money was ostensibly sitting in offshore accounts. He asked her what document she was talking about, and she said, "You know, that $2 million you have invested with him? You have some kind of documentation of this deal, right?" And Stephen was like, no. Sylvia was stunned, and she questioned him further, asking him, "You gave some man that you just met a couple years earlier $2 million and you have nothing in writing?" She, of course, in the wake of learning of Stephen's murder, told investigators all about this and everything she knew about this Harvey Morrow. And suddenly, a light bulb went off in detectives' heads. Their minds flashed directly back to the Isola Mara, that yacht. That beautiful yacht that had been undergoing a complete makeover for the better part of the last 2 years. The brand new paint, the teakwood decks, the expensive chrome fixtures, brand new sails, state-of-the-art electronics, the fireplace, the washer-dryer, the flat screens. How would a guy like Morrow, with no real history of stable work or income, be able to come up with the kinds of money for renovations like this? It dawned on them that every single luxury item on that yacht was paid for by Stephen B. All of it, unbeknownst to him. And it was all meticulously documented in a ledger that Morrow kept himself. one that detailed every single thing that he had done to that boat. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that ledger, the grand total that he put into the yacht, $1,755,043.61, an amount nearly equal to the amount of money he had stolen from Stephen. It all started making sense to investigators and to Stephen's friends. Sylvia now understood why the last time she had lunch with him, that she had to pay for the meal. She remembers him being really embarrassed about it too, and she asked him, how was this possible? And he just explained that Morrow had all his money tied up in offshore accounts. And he did have Stephen's money deposited in those offshore accounts at the Bank of Bermuda, but he brought it all back in small increments and used all of it to refurbish that yacht. And it's just like I had described Stephen earlier. He was naive and he was vulnerable, and he just didn't pick up on the warning signs that he needed to be more careful and less trusting of Morrow. But the career conman was able to easily pull the wool over Stephen's eyes. And not only his, but his wife Debbie's as well. She loved the man and was very devoted to him. But his lies to her were beginning to become apparent as well. For starters, there was this house in Vail, Colorado that he told her belonged to him. And actually, it was owned by someone else. The money she sent to him while she was working, all of that was gone too. He even told her that he was buying and paying for her auto insurance, and he never even did that. And of course, there was that giant rock she had on her hand. Fake as well. She had even reached the conclusion that not only did he not love or care for her, that he probably didn't even like her. She, of course, was devastated as she found out about all the lies he had told, all of the deceit. But she could not believe that Morrow was capable of murder. When the investigation began focusing in on her husband, there was just no way that he could have done Stephen any harm. And truth be told, there was no evidence directly linking Morrow to Stephen's murder. On the boat, there was no sign of any life or death struggle. But then again, Stephen was shot in the back of the head, so it was likely he was taken by surprise, that he never saw it coming. And then there was not a speck of Stephen's blood anywhere on the boat. Detectives really wanted to talk to Morrow. They had learned from that marina manager that he was nearby the day the search warrant of his yacht was executed. He was even observing what was going on from afar for a few moments. But by the time they had gotten word that he was close and he saw officers were there, he vanished. Investigators were able to glean some information from past friends and associates of Morrow's that maybe he would have headed south. Morrow had some business dealings in Belize, which is a small commonwealth in Central America, bordered by Mexico to the north and Guatemala to the east, and the Caribbean Sea to the west. So investigators poked around there for a bit, but turned up nothing as to Morrow's whereabouts. His trail was growing cold. So investigators looked at Morrow's cell phone records on May 26th, and according to the locations of where it was pinging, his phone left the Los Angeles area that morning around 9:48 a.m., and it had traveled to Las Vegas, Nevada. His phone stayed there overnight, and then the following day, the phone traveled to the eastern border of Nevada. And from there, no other indications of where the phone pinged was recorded. It didn't appear that he was traveling south outside of the country. It appeared that he was heading east. But where he was headed was anybody's guess. And for months, nobody knew where Harvey Morrow was. So fast forward to September 8th, 2006. at a used car dealership in Great Falls, Montana called Pete's Auto Sales. They hired in a new, smooth-talking used car salesman, the one and only Harvey Morrow. The finance man, Joseph Perpetrated, was at work the day Morrow came in for his first day on the job. Joseph right away sized up Morrow, as it came off a bit overconfident, kind of smug, and that, to him, stood out like a sore thumb in Montana. The locals are very down to earth, in his words, a meat and potatoes kind of a crowd, where everyone is friendly, everyone is neighborly, and anyone with a smug and cocky demeanor isn't going to fly with them. But Joseph, true to Montanan form, was friendly and welcoming to the new guy, giving him the benefit of the doubt. Morrow told him that he used to be a stockbroker back in Texas, and he had a waterfront home there. He even looked it up on Google Earth and showed Joseph. So naturally, he asked, why in the world would Morrow leave all of that and come to Great Falls? Well, Morrow had an explanation. A sad one, actually. A recent tragedy had brought him to Great Falls. You see, Morrow shared with him that his wife and her friends had died in a boating accident on their yacht. They had gone sailing in the Gulf of Mexico when they were hit by an unexpected storm and their boat capsized, and they were all lost at sea. And he was so distraught and shaken up by her loss that he decided he needed a change of scenery. Permanently. He needed to get as far away from bodies of water as possible. And as it would turn out, Morrow was quite the chatterbox with Joseph. And at some point in their conversations, Morrow asked him if he knew of a large bank in the area where he could access bank accounts in the Caribbean. Joseph had already had his antennas up when it came to Morrow. He was just a little bit too slick, a little bit too slippery. And there was something that Morrow did not know about Joseph. He was a retired police officer. And the more Morrow ran his mouth, the more suspicious Joseph grew of him. After that first day of work, Joseph decided to take a quick detour and go by the motel Morrow had said he was staying at. But he did not spot Morrow's SUV in the parking lot of that motel. He wasn't all that suspicious in the moment, but he decided to drive around a little bit more and pass by some of the other motels and see what he could see. And he did find Morrow's vehicle at a different motel called the Imperial Inn. So Joseph is thinking to himself, why in the world would Morrow lie about something so little as to where he was staying? Just the fact that he lied about it made it a big deal to the retired police officer. So when he got home, he fired up his computer and did some Googling. Who is Harvey Morrow? And what do you know? In the top results, a news article about the murder of a former Colorado area disc jockey, Stephen B. Williams. And Morrow was mentioned in the article as a person of extreme interest. So Joseph called the captain of the Great Falls Police Department and told him what he had found out about the new employee at his dealership. And the captain turned around and called the detective all the way back in California. His message to him? I understand you may be looking for one Harvey Morrow. The detective was super excited. Here he was looking around the British Virgin Islands, as according to everyone, that's where they thought Morrow was most likely to run to. And there he was, turned up in Montana of all places, working alongside a retired cop. One whose nose for suspiciousness hadn't retired. A very lucky break for Los Angeles investigators indeed. They soon boarded a flight headed straight for Great Falls. On September 20th, 2006, with Joseph's help, investigators managed to arrange a meeting of sorts at the car dealership. Joseph told Morrow that he needed him to go out to the lot and get one of their vehicles ready to show to a customer, that they would be showing up soon to take a look at it. And so when Morrow left the sales office and went out to the parking lot, officers from the Cascade County Sheriff's Department were there waiting for him. They informed him that there were some investigators from California that wanted to speak to him and that they were placing him under arrest. They quickly searched his vehicle that was parked at the dealership, and in it, they found a bevy of guns and ammunition. They placed Morrow in the back of their police cruiser and drove him down to the local sheriff's department for questioning. Morrow, of course, had a story at the ready. He told them that he knew that his boat had been towed away by authorities, and that the reason he didn't do anything about it was because he was so disgusted with what was happening that he decided to just leave. He had put so much money and time into restoring that boat that it had taken a detrimental toll on his marriage to Debbie, and seeing the boat getting towed off was the last straw. He was just done with the whole thing. Done with the boat, done with the dreams to sail it, and done with his wife. As for Stephen, he was under the impression that he had gone back to Hawaii to do some radio work, and he was adamant he had no idea what happened to him. They questioned him about the yacht. They wanted to focus on that, asking him how much money did he put into the boat. He said that he did not know. They asked him for his best guess, a rough estimate. He said he had no idea, that it was over a period of time. What they were trying to get was information about how much money and where did the money come from. They knew, but they wanted to hear his explanations. But he had none. He had lots of vagueness, lots of I don't knows. Investigators then shifted to Stephen, asking him if he had been the one to set up his trust fund. Morrow's answer? You lost me. They repeated, did you set up Stephen's trust fund? And he said Stephen took care of his own stuff. They asked Morrow if he had helped Stephen with his finances after his father's estate sold. And he told them, go ask Stephen. They asked him if he ever got any money from Stephen put into his own account, and he divulged that they passed money back and forth. They asked him how many times he received money from Stephen, but he said he did not remember. They asked him if he knew how much money he received from Stephen in total, and he said no, he did not remember. Morrow tried to interject, telling them that they were asking these questions, but investigators cut him off, telling him that he is a banker and that he should know the answers to these questions. At that point, he told investigators he didn't want to talk anymore, that they weren't telling him anything. And the detectives told him that they weren't done yet, and that they had a lot to tell him, and they will tell him. But Morrow, at that point, told them to tell it to his lawyer. So that ended that. He was extradited to California and charged with first-degree murder. But this wasn't exactly a slam dunk. Investigators had all the evidence in the world that Morrow stole Stephen's money, conned him out of it. But evidence that proved murder? Not so much. There was no evidence that he was the one who shot Stephen, that he was the one who callously dumped him into the Pacific Ocean. Investigators had hoped that there would be some indication that Stephen was shot on the boat. It had to have been there, but there was nothing. Forensic teams scoured the entire boat looking for any kind of DNA linking Stephen to it, but there was just nothing. No blood, no DNA, and no gun. Nothing. What they needed was some kind of proof that placed Stephen and Harvey together on the far side of Catalina Island, a place where the ocean currents would have carried his body to the place where Stephen was ultimately found floating by those pleasure boaters. Remember, they searched everywhere for that GPS device, the one whose manual was found on the boat, but not the device itself. They couldn't find it. But then, suddenly, investigators had another stroke of luck. David Van Court, the Commodore of the Los Angeles Yacht Club, had observed Morrow in the library area of the club. In February of 2007, David was in the library doing research when he happened to open a small wooden file cabinet. Tucked in the back, behind some circa 1920s yacht club records, David discovered a GPS device wrapped in a paper towel with no batteries in it. He took it home, inserted some batteries, and turned it on. He was able to observe the last trip that the GPS device had made, from the marina to Catalina, and then behind Catalina, and then back to the marina again, which he thought was a strange path. David was well aware of Stephen's death and became suspicious that the GPS might somehow be related to the case. He contacted police right away. And as it turned out, this was indeed the companion device to the manual that was discovered on Morrow's boat. And a Coast Guard special agent was able to examine the GPS and extract the data that it had stored in its memory. The GPS's very last trip was in there, in meticulous detail. On May 4th, 2006, at 1:17 p.m., the last journey of this GPS commenced, and it indicated that its exact starting point corresponded with the 6th slip in the harbor, which is the one the Harvey Morrow was docked. It headed towards Catalina Island, and then it headed around to the backside of Catalina, where it seemed to be drifting around aimlessly during the middle of the night that evening. The trip back to Catalina began at 2:14 a.m. on May 5th, and then it returned back to its dock at 5:58 a.m. And when all of this was mapped out, its exact coordinates and everything, it was almost as if you could pinpoint the exact time and place where that boat came to a stop and where Stephen's life came to an end. It stayed there for quite a long period of time, and then it turned around and headed back into the same direction from which it came. And remember, that morning of May 5th, Morrow was supposed to meet his friend for that road trip to Bishop at 5 a.m. And when he finally did show up at 6:30, his friend described him as looking a mess, as if he hadn't slept. He was totally exhausted, and he slept the entire way to Bishop. But how could they prove that this was Morrow's GPS? Yeah, the manual was on the boat, but that didn't necessarily mean it was his, and that he was the one that used it, right? Well, another stroke of luck for detectives. When Morrow purchased that GPS, a friend tagged along with him, one of the guys who had done some of the refurbishing on the boat for him, and he recalls vividly being with Morrow when he bought it. And he really liked the device a lot. So much so, he would go back and buy the exact same one for himself. But even though investigators were able to prove that this was Morrow's GPS, and they could prove that his boat was there the night of May 4th and 5th, how could they prove that he and Stephen were together on that day and into the evening? Well, it would be cell phone data again. An analysis of both of their phones showed that on May 4th, 2006, Morrow called Stephen at 11:47 a.m. using a cell tower that provided service to where his boat was docked. Stephen then returned Morrow's phone call around 1 p.m. And around 4 p.m. that same day, both of their cell phones were pinging a tower located on Blackjack Mountain on Catalina Island, which is one that provided service on the island as well as to boats located in the ocean approximately halfway to the mainland. 30 minutes later, Morrow's phone made another call using a mainland tower, so it was an expert's opinion that this was an area over the ocean where service was overlapping between Catalina towers and mainland towers. By 5:05 a.m., Morrow's phone was using a cell tower located in San Pedro. There were no more calls from Stephen's cell phone after May 4th, 2006. It should also be noted that between March 1st and May 4th, Morrow made 31 cell phone calls to Stephen's phone. After May 4th, Morrow never called or texted Stephen's phone again. At 6:45 p.m. on May 8, 2006, all calls to Stephen's phone were sent directly to voicemail. For investigators, the puzzle of this case was coming together very nicely. But there was still one question. What happened to Stephen the night he died and ended up floating in the water? Stephen had told his friends that he was planning on this sale with Morrow and that he was going to have a confrontation with him over his money. And did the confrontation turn violent? Perhaps. It seems like it did. Police formulated a theory that both men were on that boat, on the deck, and that Morrow approached Stephen from behind and shot him in the back of the head. And he either pushed Stephen overboard or he fell. And this could possibly explain the lack of blood evidence on the boat. It would eventually take 5 years to piece together this case against Morrow, along with thousands and thousands of documents outlining the deceit that was involved behind what investigators believed was the motive for the killing, to cover up the stealing of Stephen's inheritance. And all of this evidence was circumstantial. Of course, Morrow was maintaining his innocence. But something unexpected happened the first day of Morrow's trial, and it was something crucial that investigators unfortunately overlooked in the more than 30,000 pages of documents and evidence that I had just told you about. Something that I mentioned to you earlier here in this story, but they didn't notice it as they were bringing this case before the court. That promissory note. It was the contention of the defense that the money he received from Stephen was a repayment of a loan between their dads, remember? He wasn't stealing from Stephen. This money was given to him by Stephen as a repayment of that loan. And there it was, all on that promissory note. He had no motive to kill Stephen. And amid this new evidence, the prosecution overlooked it, and so they motioned for a mistrial, and one was declared. They quickly regrouped and added a new prosecutor to the case, one who was going to dig deep into this alleged loan. He could see right away that this promissory note was fraudulent, and Stephen's friends concurred. He had told them it was fake in order to circumvent tax liability on the inheritance. Now the prosecutors were ready to prove that this note was garbage. They moved forward to the second trial. The prosecutors went point by point on how Morrow had systematically drained Stephen's inheritance. And not only that, they were able to easily prove something very, very important: the extent of Morrow's cons. Remember I told you guys, I covered the story of Donald Crowhurst and his sail around the world. I came to find, and I'm sure many of you are well aware, that a circumnavigation of the earth is no walk in the park. It would take a particular kind of boat, outfitted in a particular kind of way, to make that kind of sail. And the Iola Armara was in no way, shape, or form outfitted to do so. It was little more than a miniature luxury home on the water, suited for nothing more than puttering around the calm waters of the Pacific. It was all a part of Morrow's elaborate schemes. His front, his image, his big, huge lie. They laid out the timeline, the cell phone evidence, the GPS locations, all the evidence they had, circumstantial as it were, but all of it pointing to Morrow nonetheless. But according to Morrow's defense, none of that meant that their client killed Stephen. They said Stephen was in a rough patch in life. He was depressed over his failed career, the death of his father, the prospect of getting older. This is what I was referring to earlier on when we talked about Stephen's frame of mind, Nobody who knew him would say that he was anything but his usual happy self. His biggest gripe at the time that he went missing was Morrow and his money. And the defense would claim Stephen B. killed himself. They took his own life by shooting himself in the head. The medical examiner did testify that Stephen was killed with a single gunshot to the right side of the back of his head, and he had to concede that it was possible that it could have been self-inflicted. The bullet had traveled from back to front, from right to left, and possibly slightly upwards. The coroner was unable to determine with any degree of certainty how far away the fatal shot was fired from, but he did say that the skull fracture suggested that it was a close shot, as opposed to a shot from a distance. It was his strong opinion that the gunshot was neither self-inflicted nor was it an accident, but there was that small chance that it could have been Stephen himself who did it. Not likely, but possible. The search of the ORBITAL, as I said earlier, did not reveal any blood evidence that would tie Stephen's death to the boat. There were no firearms recovered from that boat either. The keys to Stephen's car were on the boat, and his car was still parked in the marina, and it did appear that it had been there for quite some time. After finding Morrow in Montana, they did search his Land Rover. They found an LG cell phone that was no longer in service, as well as a Virgin Mobile pay-as-you-go phone, including a receipt that showed it had been purchased on May 27, 2006 in Las Vegas. This coincided with the cell phone tower pings investigators had earlier traced to the Nevada border. This is where his phone last pinged, as he headed east towards Great Falls. Police also found a Decca Limited document embosser. Okay, so that I would assume is something that Morrow used to create documents for his so-called offshore dealings. They also found some weapons and ammunition, but none of those items were the murder weapon. The murder weapon was never recovered. The defense presented the fact that Morrow's DNA nor his fingerprints were found on the GPS device uncovered in the yacht club library or on the paper towel in which it was wrapped. And Harvey Morrow did take the stand to testify in his own defense. Not everyone was convinced that he would take the stand, but the prosecutor who was brought in on the onset of the second trial, he was pretty certain Morrow would get up there and testify on his own behalf. It was his impression that Morrow was the ultimate con man. He saw himself as the smartest guy in the room, and that he could talk anybody into believing anything that he said. And Morrow certainly did have an explanation for just about everything that he was confronted with. And not only that, he did it with complete confidence and self-assurance. He insisted the promissory note was genuine and was created at his father's request. He said the loan was a combination of his money and his father's money. He said the signature was the way it was on the document when he received it in the mail from Bailey Williams. He said that he had spoken to Bailey many times on the phone, and his introduction to Stephen through their mutual friend Niebuhr was serendipitous. That it was chance and coincidence that Morrow had conducted this large loan between himself, his father, and Stephen's dad, only for years later to happen to befriend the son of the man he had known all those years earlier, supposedly. And the agreement was that the loan would be paid off when the Corona Del Mar house appreciated to a value that would allow him to be able to pay back the loan, plus interest. He said that the night before he went on that fishing trip with his friend to Bishop, he had spent the night on the boat, but insisted he did not take it to Catalina. He said that he was late to meet for the trip because he overslept. And he said that when he returned from Bishop that Stephen was gone, as were all of his belongings. He said that he made no attempts to contact Stephen or to find out where he was because he had become very aggravated with him and his flightiness. He said Stephen had taken off several times before without telling anyone, and furthermore, he brought up the marijuana incident, telling the court that he had asked him to not smoke on the boat. Morrow said that he believed Stephen had gone to Hawaii because Stephen had talked about going there to transfer some of his old radio tapes to CDs. He said that when he arrived at the marina, he saw police officers, but he first believed that they were there from a film crew shooting a scene for a TV show or a movie, which is very common all over Southern California. He testified that once he realized that officers towed his boat, he freaked out. He was certain that it was towed because of Stephen's stupidity, and what he meant by that was Stephen's incessant marijuana smoking, which had led to the boat being seized by authorities for marijuana-related crimes. Morrow testified that he found a large bag of marijuana hidden under a floorboard of the boat, and that Stephen had given two men $75,000 each as startup money for a marijuana farm. He said that where he's from in Texas, having marijuana on a boat will get you 20 years. He also pointed the finger at his friend, Mr. Lambono, the man who he went to Bishop with. He said that he knew Lambono had been arrested in the past for attempting to smuggle undocumented immigrants into the United States by boat, and that he had recently used his boat, and he thought maybe his boat was being seized because of that. He said that he became so upset, he started drinking and meandering across the United States and ended up in Great Falls. He said that he lied to the finance manager about his wife's death in that tragic boating accident because he was so nosy and he wanted to shut him up. During his testimony, Morrow said that Stephen would always get very strange around his birthday, that he would get depressed and hide out. He didn't want to be near people, and that he feared aging and getting older. And when his friend, the financial advisor, had gotten married a few weeks prior to his having disappeared, this was a huge blow to Stephen. Morrow was under the impression that Stephen was in love with his friend, and him getting married pushed him over the edge. Morrow claimed that he lived off of money he had made from his career as a stockbroker, and he kept all of his money in cash and kept it in safe deposit boxes. He said his wife made good money, which he also sent to him while he was working on refurbishing the boat, and he insisted that he was financially sound and did not need Stephen's inheritance. He denied killing Stephen and insisted he had absolutely no reason to. Morrow conducted himself on the stand with so much confidence and poise. Stephen's friends were worried. Was the jury buying what he was selling? He conned Stephen. Would he actually be able to con the ladies and gentlemen of the jury as well? They took 2 days to deliberate their verdict. And in spite of all the stories that he spun, all of his explanations, excuses, deflection of responsibility onto others, Harvey Morrow was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Stephen B. Williams. The jury found that the murder was carried out for financial gain, and it was Morrow who personally and intentionally used and discharged a firearm, causing Stephen's death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 25 years. All of Stephen's friends were in the gallery, watching the man who took his life be convicted of it. They held hands and they cried, and they breathed a sigh of relief that this man was unable to con his way out of this. In the end, at the sentencing, Stephen's friend stood up for him and spoke about him on behalf of all of them and told the court what Stephen meant to them and how his death impacted their lives. He reminded Morrow that for 3 years he pretended to be Stephen's friend, building up this dream of sailing around the world that was never going to be, and he knew it was never going to happen, all the while using Stephen, stealing from him, taking everything his father had worked all those years to save up, to leave behind for his children to live comfortable lives, ultimately taking the one thing that could never be gotten back, Stephen's life. His friend told Morrow that he worships a false god, a god of arrogance, ego, and greed. And this would be the day that their heartache ends and his begins. And as for Debbie Morrow, the ex-wife, She looked out to the ocean and thought about Stephen. She took all that fake jewelry that Morrow had, that he had given her over the years, and tossed everything overboard into the ocean. Stephen's friends still think about him every day. He left behind a lifetime of wonderful memories for them to cherish. They just imagine him living his dream out there somewhere, like the free spirit he'd always been in life. And that brings this episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the radio star, to a close. If you would like to join the discussion, come to Facebook and request to join and like the page. The past couple of weeks, we've been having quite the discussion about our 3-part series, plus the addendum episode on Elliot Rodger, the Isla Vista killer. And we also had all kinds of opinions all over the place about Michael Peterson, the staircase owl guy. Seems the consensus is split right down the middle on that one. I still need to watch The Staircase on Netflix. If I binge too much stuff, I'm never going to get these shows out there for you guys, so just saying. If you like the show and you have something you'd like to say about it, please feel free to go over to iTunes and leave a star rating and a review. 5 stars, of course, would be nice. It does help give the show more visibility and reaches more people. California Dreaming has also created a Patreon. This is a way for you to help us create more and better content for you, the listeners. For as little as $1 a month, you can be a part of helping me put not only this show out there each week, but also gain access to all of the bonus content that's available on Patreon. I usually have 1 episode a month, with possibly 1 episode for the higher tier Patreon supporters, if time allows. If every single person who downloaded California Dreaming gave $1, I could quit my day job and do this stuff for y'all all the time. How amazing would that be? So, visit the California Dreaming Patreon page and see what's available for you there. And a tremendous thanks to all of you who have jumped in on Patreon to help support me bring this show to you. I am so, so grateful. I can't tell you enough. Thank you. And California Dreaming is proudly brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a podcast production company located in Los Angeles, California, with a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to consistently improve upon our current roster of shows, to develop new content that appeals to people all over the world, and to provide a thriving community for listeners and podcasters alike. I, for one, am so proud to be a part of an eclectic group of shows and hosts, including The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Super Nerds UK, 41 Owned, Historium, Vox Arcana, and The Podience. So please visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You can also find all the links to our shows, our merchandise store, our blog, and if you want to just email us and let us know what you think, you could do that too. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you again for joining me for this week's 53rd episode. There is still time to call California Dreaming and leave a message for me to play on this week's upcoming anniversary special. The number is area code 530-346-4084. Thank you to all of you who have left those kind messages so far. And until next time, sweet dreams.
Hey guys, women can do anything. They can be scientists, lawyers, lumberjacks, and yes, even killers, drug lords, and kingpins. If you live for true crime and aren't so secret about your feminist agenda, check out the Lady Killers podcast with your hosts Kelly Megan and Bryn Mack as they delve into the often overlooked world of the women in true crime.
Kelly and Bryn are just a couple of murder buffs, feminists, and friends who want to spread the word that serial killers are not cute.
They're not.
Join them every Tuesday as they look into the crimes of the world's most dangerous women, while also discussing societal issues that women may face. Available on most major podcast platforms everywhere, and as always,
Don't play with mercury.
and don't murder people.
Hey, crime fans. This is Gemma Hoskins from The Keepers. I would like to invite you to take a listen to the new podcast series called The Redhead Murders. My friend, podcaster, Shane Waters, has invited me to work with him on this very cold case of women who were murdered 30-some years ago, all in the same area of the United States. Of course, being a redhead myself and being a practicing PI, sort of, I am delighted to work with Shane. So I'm inviting you to listen to the new Redhead Murders on Out of the Shadows podcast. You can also take a look at the Redhead Murders Facebook page. Please join us. Please try and help us. Over and out. Peace.
You can find our podcast, Out of the Shadows, in all podcast outlets. Visit us online at shadowspod.com. See you there.